How Charlie George wasted his career is a story told by those who never understood what made him special. But what if Charlie George was never meant to follow the rules? What if his rebellion wasn't a flaw, but the very thing that made him a legend? George made his Arsenal debut on 9th of August 1969 against Everton. He was just 17. 2 games later, he scored his first goal against West Bromwich Albion. The crowd could see something special. This wasn't just another young player. This was different. George had what coaches call natural ability, but he also had something else, something that would define his entire career. His first season saw him spend 3 months in the reserves. The reason was simple: ill discipline. While other players followed instructions, George questioned them. While others stayed quiet, George spoke up. Some called it attitude. Others saw it as character. The truth was probably both. Arsenal manager Bertie Mee came from a military background. He ran the club like an army unit. Everyone had their place. Everyone followed orders. Mee would brook no argument from players about anything. His way was the only way. For most players, this worked fine. For Charlie George, it was torture. George helped Arsenal win the European Fairs Cup in 1970. Even Johan Cruyff praised his performance, but Mee couldn't see past the rebellion. George brought swagger to a disciplined team. He injected creativity into rigid tactics. The fans loved it. The manager hated it. The clashes became legendary. George called Mee pompous in his autobiography. He said, "Mee couldn't handle individualism when it came with attitude." Mee saw George as a disruptive influence. By the 1974-75 season, they barely spoke. George publicly said both would be better off if Mee sold him. The relationship was beyond repair, but George wasn't just difficult for the sake of it. His teammate Bob Wilson believed a less rigid manager might have let George do his own thing. Don Howe, Mee's coach, admitted the difficulty of managing someone who became a star before he was ready. The problem wasn't George's talent. The problem was a system that couldn't adapt to genius. The incidents piled up. George headbutted Liverpool's Kevin Keegan during the 1971-72 season. He flicked a V sign at Derby County fans after scoring. Against Newcastle, in January 1973, he retaliated after a cynical foul by David Craig. The media painted him as undisciplined. The fans saw him as authentic. Newcastle manager Joe Harvey was clever. He manipulated the press to blame George for the incident. Headlines criticised Arsenal's lack of discipline. Some even linked it to society's declining values. But the players shook hands after the game. It was theatre, but the damage to George's reputation was real. Eventually, some Arsenal teammates suggested it was time for George to go. Mee felt he could finally sell his problem player. In July 1975, George transferred to Derby County for $100,000. He thought a fresh start might help. He was wrong. At Derby, George found his form again. He scored 24 goals in all competitions during one memorable season. Derby were genuine contenders for the double. They had lost only one of their previous 11 games. George was the key to everything they did well. Then disaster struck. In March 1976, during a match against Stoke City, George dislocated his shoulder and fractured his elbow. The injuries ended his season. Without their star player, Derby collapsed. They managed only 6 points from their remaining 14 matches. They finished 4th. George later said Derby would have won the double if he hadn't been injured. Nobody disagreed. The injuries were becoming a pattern. George's body couldn't handle the physical demands of professional football. Each setback came at the worst possible moment. His timing was cursed. His England career lasted exactly 1 match. In September 1976, manager Don Revie selected George for a game against the Republic of Ireland. George was substituted and had a blazing row with Revie. He was never picked again. 1 cap, 1 argument, 1 wasted opportunity. The pattern continued at Southampton. George arrived for $350,000, but his knee was already a problem. He admitted relief that it passed the medical examination. The knee kept swelling up. Manager Laurie McMenemy started looking for a new face. Over 2 seasons, George missed exactly half of Southampton's league fixtures. Then came the strangest injury of all. George had a lawnmower accident that cost him a finger. Fans created a chant based on the children's song, "One Man Went to Mow." Even his injuries became part of football folklore. Teammate Mick Channon joked that if Charlie had been a horse, they would have shot him. But here's is what the critics missed. George's rebellious streak and his injury problems fed off each other. Frustration with his body made him more difficult to manage. Clashes with authority affected his recovery. It was a cycle that nobody knew how to break. Modern football might have handled George differently. Today's managers work with sports psychologists. They understand that talent comes in many forms. They adapt their methods to suit different personalities. George was ahead of his time, but playing in the wrong era. The label stuck. Flawed genius. People said he wasted his talent. They pointed to his single England cap as proof, but they missed the bigger picture. George's authenticity made him special. His refusal to conform made him memorable. His struggles made him human. Arsenal fans never stopped loving him. They saw past the headlines to the heart of the player. George represented something pure about football. He was one of them, a local boy who made it but stayed true to himself. That mattered more than trophies or caps. Today, George works for Arsenal in corporate hospitality. He shares his stories with new generations of fans. He remains connected to the club he loves. His autobiography shows unflinching honesty about his career. He doesn't make excuses or blame others. He owns his choices. The supporters still sing his name. They remember the FA Cup final goal. They remember the celebration. They remember a player who brought magic to ordinary matches. George gave them moments they will never forget. That's worth more than perfect discipline. Football needs characters like Charlie George, players who colour outside the lines, artists who refuse to be tamed, rebels who remind us why we fell in love with the game. George was messy and brilliant and unforgettable. That's exactly what made him special. The real tragedy wasn't George's supposed wasted talent. The tragedy was a football system that couldn't accommodate brilliance in an unconventional package. George represented everything that made football beautiful in the 1970s. Raw passion, local pride, unfiltered emotion. Players today are coached from childhood to say the right things and follow the right paths. George never learned those lessons. He remained wonderfully, stubbornly himself. His story teaches us something important about talent. It doesn't always come wrapped in discipline and professionalism. Sometimes it arrives messy and complicated and difficult to handle. The best managers learn to work with what they have rather than trying to change what makes a player special. Me and Reeve failed this test. They saw George's rebellion as something to crush rather than channel. George's injuries were cruel, but they weren't the whole story. Even when fit, he struggled in systems that demanded conformity. His best moments came when he was allowed to express himself. The FA Cup final goal, his performances in the European Fairs Cup, his brilliant spell at Derby before the injuries hit. These weren't accidents. They were glimpses of what could have been with better man management. Modern football has learned from players like George. Today's coaches understand that creativity requires freedom. They build systems around their best players rather than forcing square pegs into round holes. George would have thrived in today's game. His personality would have been seen as refreshing rather than problematic. The fans understood this long before the coaches did. They loved George's authenticity. They appreciated his refusal to pretend. In an era of increasing commercialization, George remained genuinely connected to his roots. He spoke like them. He acted like them. He was them, just with extraordinary football ability. His legacy extends beyond statistics and trophies. George proved that football is about more than winning. It's about identity and emotion and belonging. He gave Arsenal supporters something precious, a player who truly represented them. That connection survives decades after his retirement. It will outlast any criticism of his career choices. Charlie George didn't waste his career. He lived it on his own terms. He bent football to fit his story rather than changing himself to fit football's expectations. Some called it failure. Those who understood called it authenticity. He showed that sometimes being true to yourself matters more than being perfect. And that's why, 50 years later, they still chant his name with genuine love and admiration.